Hi everyone, my name is Hannah. I'm going to be speaking to you tonight around wealth creation, how to invest to grow options. If you've got questions during tonight's presentation, just pop them in the Q&A section and that will go through to my producer. And she's collating some questions if we have some time, but we've got quite a lot of things to get through as we try and set the scene. So today is of general nature. So it's not specific financial advice. The idea is to get specific financial advice, you need to have a consultation with a financial advisor who isn't just going to sell you product or specialize in product, but instead specialize in setting your strategy. I always get a bit confused how people can sell product without an independent strategy. So we're going to talk about that at the end. A little bit about me. I'm a financial advisor, I'm a financial strategist, and I'm a financial coach. So my job is to help give you confidence, to help you do better, to save more, to help you get in control of your money, to get retirement ready, and to help you grow wealth. And I've got a team of financial coaches who do that as well, right around the country. But our job is to create wealth so you have more options for the future. Tonight, we're going to cover why you need to grow wealth, wealth building principles, understanding your timeline, which creates constraints, changes the objective possibly of what we're trying to do within a period of time. We want to talk about how you create your personalized wealth plan, which tends to focus on growing wealth for the next 5 years, what you're doing in the next 10 years and beyond, and understand your options, your risk appetite, the amount of reward you need to get for the risk that you're taking, and how you adjust your plan for your individual goals. There'll be some key takeaways and some time for Q&A if everything goes to plan. But first poll of the night, because I want to try and tailor this for you. What is your timeline to retirement? Because that is the linchpin in determining what are the options available to you when it comes to growing wealth. So do you have less than 5 years until you retire? 5 to 10, 10 to 20, or 20 plus, or are you already retired? If you can fill that in, that would be great. Okay, so what we've got here, the majority of us have 5 to 10 years. Some have, so 6% have less than 5 years, 34% have 5 to 10 years, 22 of us watching have 10 to 20, and 38% have more than 20 years. Depending on your runway to retirement will determine what strategy is going to be most applicable to you. I guess there's a genuine assumption that the closer you are to retirement, the more wealth you have. If you've got a long way to go to retirement, there's the possibility you're not even yet on the property ladder. So again, we're going to adjust our strategies depending on how long we've got and what we've got to play with. So the first question is, why do we grow wealth? Well, there's a few reasons, but the old advice no longer cuts the mustard because now it's harder than ever to get onto the property ladder. Most of us are not on track to be mortgage-free by retirement. Few of us are on track to have grown enough wealth to retire comfortably, and that's before we even help out our kids. So I guess for those who are waiting for perfect conditions for financial progress to take hold, well, that assumption is a little bit flawed. So we've got to crack on when we can't afford to wait, because 65% of Kiwis are worried they aren't on track for retirement. 56% of Kiwis don't feel prepared. 70% of Kiwis think that they might need to work past the age of 70. 135,000 Kiwis over 65 still have a mortgage, and 1 million parents are supporting their adult children, right? So the conditions are worsening, and I can't change the conditions. I can just change how you respond to the conditions. And before I get into that in too much detail and talk about the plan, I guess wealth gives you more options to do what you want to do. It allows you to live where you want to live. Wealth improves your security. It helps you leave a legacy, and it might allow you to retire early. That's why we create wealth. So the next question is, well, what's your plan? I guess most of us don't know necessarily how much we're going to need for retirement, but as a general rule, you need a mortgage-free home, you need financially independent kids, and you need about $1 million to work with. And that's on the assumption that we haven't had a capital gains tax and that we're still getting the pension. If those assumptions change, then you're going to need a whole lot more wealth if you're trying to maintain your lifestyle for as long as possible. And wouldn't you know it, we're living longer than what we've lived before as well. So the longer you live, the more money you're going to need. That's okay. So my job is to create a plan, and a plan starts by knowing, well, where are you now? What are we aiming for? How long do we have to get there? What are your tendencies, and what is the hand you've got to work with? And there's no bad hand, but some of us have different trump cards, and depending on the cards you've got to play it a particular way to maximize your ability to create forward propulsion, to maximize your wealth creation. And for most of us, it's going to come down to 3 things that you're going to have to do at the same time because conditions are not favorable, or the closer you are to retirement, the more likely you'll need to do all 3 things at once. If you've got time in the sun, a long time till you retire, you could slowly implement these 3 things. But I guess the benefit with doing it all at once is that you create more wealth faster. The more wealth you've got, the more options you've got around how long you work for. The 3 things are, we've got to maximize your savings rate. And most of us aren't particularly good at saving. And it's not because we don't understand the principles of spending less than you earn. And it's not for many of us because we don't earn enough, as we're not particularly good at our psychology of spending. So we've got to maximize your savings. We've got to get rid of your mortgage as fast as possible. So we can't, I guess, drift towards 30 years to pay off your mortgage. We've got to get that gone fast, and we need to grow wealth at the same time. So those 3 things feed in together. Arguably, increasing your savings rate is a form of wealth creation. Also, paying off your mortgage is a form of wealth creation, as is creating wealth outside of those 2 components. So we want to do all 3 things at once because we're not here to diddle around, right? And a good plan must understand, well, what is the problem that we need to solve? It's got to understand who you are and what you're not. It has to remove inefficiencies, and most of us are comfortably inefficient when it comes to managing our money. It's got to create better systems so that it becomes effortless. Effortless means it's sustainable. We've got a good plan allows you to develop a wealth mindset. And most importantly, it focuses on execution. You have to clinically execute the plan if we are serious about achieving the wealth goals. Because for most of us, the problem is pretty big, right? So just kind of sleepwalking towards it is not going to actually solve it. And it's not the end of the world if you don't have enough money for retirement, but it has an impact, doesn't it? Because if you don't have enough money, it means that you need to downsize your home earlier. You probably need to move. You might need to move into a different area. You're not able to help your kids as much as you want. You probably become stressed out about that, and you don't live a particularly good retirement. I don't know if that's the end of the world, but it does have an implication, right? So we're going to design a plan that's going to understand, well, what's the gap that you need to close? And based on the size of that gap and the hands you've been dealt, how you are best to close it. And then, as I say, we execute on that plan and we adjust, we measure, we readjust, and we reset. And the reality about money, most of us think if I just earn more money, I would be better off. But what happens is when you earn more money, you have permission to not worry about the money. So you get a bit of creep, lifestyle creep, a bit of fritter. If you are banking on, if I just earn more, it's going to be okay, that's probably the fastest way to not be okay. Financial success is about behavior, your tendencies around money, and the strategy of how you're going to play to those. Maximizing your savings, step 1. You've got to do that by focusing on four things. Understanding your money habits, setting clear goals, what your mindset around money is, what are the money stories that you have told yourself or you've been brought up around. You've got to understand how to design a cash flow plan and actually stick to it. So we've got to strengthen that. So that's your financial foundation. And then we overlay managing your mortgage to get you mortgage free faster. And on average, we want to get you mortgage free in 8 years, not 30 for our clients. That's what we want to do. And we want to lift our savings rate on average by about 300%. So when we're trying to improve or understand your psychology of spending, we need to understand what's your spending tendencies, what's your rate of ambition. Like, the more ambitious you are, do you lean in or do you get freaked out? I've got to understand that. Most of us want to be financially successful, but at some point our willpower leaves us. So what are your willpower tendencies and what are your triggers? I want to know how much you're saving now. Where are your spending and saving inefficiencies? And most of the saving or spending inefficiencies are around how you structure your mortgage and your insurances, and even how your KiwiSaver is structured. So these are things that aren't even really linked to things that are important to you or discretionary spending, but that's where most of the inefficiencies sit that we find with our clients. But let's understand your spending. Like, if you had money, are you a natural saver or a spender? Because depending on what you are, we've got a different strategy of how we're going to keep you on the reservation. So if you're a spender, you find it easy to spend. It's not that you can't save, but you're just not inclined to save. And without a kind of a meaty goal, you're just relaxed around your saving. You probably derive some satisfaction from spending money. It doesn't have to be on yourself. It doesn't mean that you're a selfish person. You probably are more generous. But if we go to a saver, that person actually finds it uncomfortable to spend money. They prefer to save. And without a doubt, that's an advantage, right? Like, if that's how you're programmed. I mean, I'm a shopper. I know, well, I can save. I can live within my means. It just doesn't excite me. So you are what you are. Like, that's okay. What I know about shoppers firsthand is we need a big goal. We're good at paying off debt, but we are useless at saving. Whereas savers are good at saving, but they aren't particularly ambitious when it comes to growing wealth and exposing themselves to leverage or debt to do so. The combinations are interesting, like the shopper combo, looking good, going nowhere, but having a good time. Shopper saver combo, probably an undercurrent of frustration with each other. The saver's not really making much progress and the shopper feels bad for spending any money, right? So that you still might have similar money goals, but your underlying money stories, money values could be slightly different. The saver combo, you have an advantage. You will be very good. You'll know where your money goes. I'm just not convinced you're making much progress relative to that. So anyway, you are what you are, but depending on what you are, I've got a different way that I'd play your hand. And then I need to understand your ambition levels. So those who are more ambitious, the more ambitious the goal, we can be ambitious with the plan to get you to that goal. And you're normally a shopper because you need something to keep you engaged. Whereas the savers tend to be safety conscious. And that, I guess, on the one hand, it means that they look after their day-to-day money well, but they don't necessarily accompany that with the wealth strategy they need. And I guess that's one of the problems, challenges of this generation compared to our grandparents. In our grandparents' day, as long as you were a good saver, you were going to be okay in the end. Whereas now, even if you are a good saver, that's still not enough to get you mortgage free at the pace that you need to, or grow enough wealth outside of being mortgage free to solve your retirement. A dreamer is someone who believes that the universe will provide and it will be okay in the end. Dreamers make great friends, terrible financial strategists. Then I need to understand your cash position. Are you sinking, floating, or flying? If you're sinking, we've got to triage it. We've got to stop it, and we've got to get you to a floating position. Most of us are floating to start with, so not going backwards, but just not getting ahead particularly fast. And some of us are flying, and we're trying to get you all to that flying stage, which means you're saving no less than 20% of your income, and where we can, to get you flying as high as possible. And all this is about maximizing your cash surplus. Now, if the money story that you've been taught by your parents or that you've told yourself is that you can't get ahead, we need to kind of reprogram that as part of trying to redesign, rebuild your money habits to then help you focus on the things that are going to actually get you there. So we need to understand your starting point, which is what those things are and what your natural tendencies are, so that helps us optimize your cash flow. when we're working with our clients, we try and, on average, 15% of their money gets frittered. So in the absence of working to a plan, it's sort of just money that slips through the cracks, 15%. Most of that money, that savings, actually comes from restructuring your mortgage or doing things that aren't linked to your spending. It's about just trying to find efficiencies within your costs. But 15%. So the next question I want to ask, so we've got in the audience, we've got some people who are coming close to retirement and some people who have a little way to go. I want to know how many of you are mortgage free. Now, some of you, or how long until you are mortgage free? Some of you don't own a home, so that's helpful. So we'll talk about that. Some of you have another 20 to 30 years left, or 5 to 20 years, or less than 5 years. Can you just give me an idea so that I can work out what I need to tell you? Okay, so we've got 18% who don't have their own home. So I'm going to assume that those are the younger people. Most 25% are mortgage free. So around 20% don't have a home. The rest are paying off their mortgage. Most of you have more than 5 years on that mortgage, and some are mortgage free. Okay. So for those who aren't yet on the property ladder, our objective is to get you more on the property ladder as quickly as possible. And that's simply because when you're on the property ladder, you benefit from leverage, and leverage allows your contribution to that investment to increase by around 3 times or 300% more than a non-leveraged asset. The challenge, if you're not yet on the property ladder, is you need to save a deposit. So you're probably going to need to have your money invested in managed funds to get your money working harder so that you can withdraw that in order to buy your first property. It's probable that that property should be an investment property rather than the home that you're going to live in. So that's just a couple of things there just to be mindful of. Okay, so if we've got a mortgage, there's 50% of you have a mortgage and you're on track for it to take more than 5 years to pay off. So that's the thing that we've got to focus on next. Now, when we come to structure our mortgages, because we're all about optimizing debt. In fact, Enable Me started from that very concept of how did I get rid of my own mortgage as fast as possible. So you'll know that when you take out a mortgage, my mortgage initially when I was young was $350,000, and I was going to pay $1 million back to the bank. So almost 3 times what I borrowed, I was going to pay back to the bank. And I thought if I could negotiate a really good interest rate, that would save me more money. And it does, but it's fractional. So for me, I negotiated a really good interest rate and it was going to save me $12,000 out of the $1 million I was going to repay. So it's not about the interest rate, it's about the pace at which you do repay it. So what I did is I had some pretty excruciating conversations with the bank around how I should structure my mortgage and didn't get particularly far with that. So I called the calculus department of the University of Auckland. This is about, I don't know, 15 odd years ago. And I asked if they would help me work on a formula to structure my mortgage so that I could pay it off as fast as possible at the lowest cost and with maximum flexibility. And over a period of 6 months, we worked on a formula, which was about eight pages of calculus, which we patented. And that would save me the size of my mortgage and interest costs. And it told me how I needed to structure my mortgage to allow that. So for me, my mortgage was $350,000. I could save $350,000 in interest, which was a whole lot better than the measly interest rate discount that I've negotiated. But for that formula to work, which is sort of a foundation principle at Enable Me, but for that formula to work, I needed to have money left over to put towards paying off my mortgage faster. Which is why we have spent so much time focusing on maximizing your cash surplus. Because although I am an accountant and a financial advisor and I've got my master's in tax, so I'm kind of financially wired. And I could write a budget, I could color code a budget. I just couldn't stick to a budget. So I had this amazing formula that was so powerful, but without the cash surplus, almost became redundant. So that's when we started to focus on, okay, well, let's look at some different ratios, because it had to be, because I'm a shopper, you've got to make it worth my while if you want me to save. So here are some things that became quite interesting to me as I started to unravel or unpack how the banks make so much money from us. So the first thing you need to understand is your debt to equity ratio. So that's your or your income to debt ratio is sort of the inverse of that. So if my household income was $100,000 after tax and my mortgage was $400,000, that's a 1-to-4 ratio. So that ratio is more important than the fact that I earn $100,000 after tax for my household, right? It's the ratio. So back of an envelope, you jot down now what your household income is roughly, like again, back of a fag packet, we don't care too much. What's your mortgage size? And then what's the ratio between the two? So if you were to divide your mortgage by your household income, what's the number? That's your ratio. If your ratio is 1-to-4, I would expect to get you mortgage free in 8 years. If it's 1-to-5, maybe 10 or 11 years. And if your ratio is more than 1-to-5, we need to think about actually selling your property or doing something a little bit creative with your mortgage, because you are putting too much downward pressure on yourself, which is going to make it very difficult to build momentum. So that ratio we pay attention to, and I guess when you can start to see how quickly we can optimize your debt to pay it off and to try and systemize that so it feels effortless, it gets easier to make progress. But the problem with financial progress is that it's really linear. So a lot of us just want to know, how much do I need to, what am I going to save each month, or on average, what is it likely to be? And I guess traditionally or commonly, we would annualize your annual savings, which we call your annual surplus, and we'd just divide that by 12. And we'd say, well, if your annual surplus was $12,000, we'd expect you to save $1,000 a month, which makes sense, I guess, just trying to smooth out that progress. But the problem is you don't save $1,000 a month. Life isn't linear. Some of your fixed costs, of course, are linear, but they account for less than 50% of your outgoings. And sometimes your income can be linear, but for many of us, I think more than 50% of us, there is variations in your income over the course of the year. Now, the impact of that is that it can make it really difficult to understand the progress you should be banking each month based on the month that it is. And if you don't know what you're aiming for, then you don't know if you're on track or not. So say if your annual progress was $12,000 for the year, and traditionally we'd say that's $1,000 a month. Well, often there will be one quarter where you make no progress, just to do with the timing of income or timing of outgoings. Another quarter you might make 50% of the annual progress, and the other quarters you might be making just a fraction. If you don't know that in advance, you have no idea of how you're tracking relative to your plan. And the problem with most financial plans is that they assume that life is linear. And our experience is we actually need to get into the nitty-gritty of this so you can see with certainty the volatility that is ahead of you, and we prepare for that. We don't ever pretend, we prepare. So here's a couple that we started working with in 2017. So a little while ago, they were in their mid-30s. So I'm just trying to illustrate maximizing your surplus to pay off your mortgage faster with some of the foundation blocks of how we do that. They had a mortgage of $700,000. They were on track to pay that off over 30 years. Working with us, we thought we could get them mortgage free in 12 years, following our plan and keeping them on the straight and narrow. So that makes sense. In reality, we got them mortgage free in 4 years, which is incredible. So we're tracking that progress. So I guess if you put a magnifying glass on that graph from month to month, it's actually quite jarring, going up and down. And you've got, unless you know that that's coming, then you could feel surprised. And you shouldn't. Financial success is about minimizing the surprises, right? So that's awesome. And we track them every quarter to make sure they're on track. Between starting with us getting mortgage free and today, they also obviously became mortgage free on their home, bought a car, got married, did a renovation on their home and traveled overseas. Because financial success is about living the life you enjoy, but also about knowing future you is going to be okay, right? It's about balancing those two things. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, when you've got your plan and you know you're mortgage free or you're on track to achieve your goals, it's freeing to spend money on things. It feels good because it's all factored in. They've also purchased 2 investment properties. Right, we're going to get a bit of a canter going, bit of a trot. So that was just focusing initially on maximizing their surplus, getting them mortgage free, and then we were trying to position them so that we could use their equity in their property to secure another 2 properties. So then that kind of naturally segues into growing wealth, because that's important. So if you do get, and remember, for most of my clients, I'm trying to grow wealth while I pay off their mortgage. But let's assume you've paid off your mortgage, or let's assume you don't have a mortgage, either because you haven't yet bought a property or you've paid it off, but there's no mortgage in this situation. And you've got money, you're able to save. What do you do with that money? And depending on whether you're not yet on the property ladder or preparing for retirement, so kind of 2 different ends of the spectrum, you've got options. But it could range from managed funds, bonds, gold, art. You could put your money into digital currencies, shares, term deposit, forestry, property, business. These are all your options. What's going to be the best option for you? Well, that's going to depend on the problem we're trying to solve and the time frame we have to solve it in. So when we're trying to determine, well, of all those options, they're all genuine wealth options, which one's best? Well, we focus on what's the size of the problem. We pay attention to what is your current rate of savings and what have you got in savings. So what have you saved and how fast are you adding to that little pot? We then pay attention to the time frame that we need to have the money or the problem solved by. We've got to understand the volatility that you can stomach and the return that you need to get. And then we need to understand, can you access leverage or not? If you're not yet on the property ladder, you can't access leverage. Maybe through your parents or friends you could, but you can't directly do that yourself. If you already own a property, whether you're mortgage free or not, you've got equity in that property. If you've got more than 20% equity in that property, you have the ability to access leverage. So depending on the answer to those questions will determine which of all of those wealth options are going to be suitable for you. And I don't care which one we do. I just want to make sure that we've solved the problem. So when we're trying to project your retirement, we're trying to work out, well, based on what you're doing at the moment, are you on track to save enough to fund your lifestyle for as long as possible? And we overlay things that, look, your KiwiSaver will be at a higher balance, and at some point the kids should move out, so those costs come down. Your insurances should reduce in time. Like, we're trying to make it, just trying to project what we're dealing with if you'd make no improvements to how you manage money, but you have the benefit of just time passing on. If there is a gap, and most of our clients, well, most of Kiwis have a gap, they're not on track to save enough to live the lifestyle they are accustomed to. If that gap is more than $300,000, then it is likely you need to think about using leverage to close it, because those other assets, other wealth options that I showed you, are unlikely to give you a predictable probability of resolution. And on an amazing day, they might happen to give you a return, but if we're going to try and bet the house on it, they are unlikely to give the return we need within the time frame we need it. And that's what we've got to pay attention to. So, and you can see in this little example down here, this client is on track to be mortgage free at 55. And so then it's a whole lot easier to save, in theory, once you're mortgage free. So they save a whole lot up until they retire, and that's when their KiwiSaver's paid out and all of these things. And then they start to eat into that money. They've got to live. The pension's not enough for them, which is normal. Who can live off a pension? Very few of us can live off a pension. But based on this sort of illustration, they run out of money at 75, and we're trying to get it so that their money runs out at 90. So the difference between when the money runs out and the age we want is their gap. And when I'm saying if that gap is more than $300,000, you're going to have to use leverage, which means you're going to have to buy an investment property. But the property needs to be a good property. And 95% of the properties on the market are not suitable to own as an investment property. So I guess I might use a broad term of investment property, but I'm actually being very specific in the criteria of what that property needs to look like if it's actually going to solve the problem. So then I've got another client, Jim and Kathy. They're pretty cool. Early 50s. When we do the projection, they've got a retirement gap of 550,000. They bought a 3-bedroom home in Papamoa in 2020. Then the purchase price was 665. Today it's worth 860. So they've made capital growth on that property. It's not realized, but that's the idea. If they can hold that property for another 10 years, then in theory, that should close out their retirement gap. Now, being able to hold the property, this is the investment property, is easier said than done, depending on your situation and how strong your cash surplus is. So we've got to pay attention to all of those things. But if we look at this situation here, so we had a client, if they did nothing, you can see the dotted blue line, they were on track to be mortgage free at retirement, 65. Their KiwiSaver paid out, but they ran out of money at 69. We could maximize their surplus and get them mortgage free 10 years earlier. So we got them mortgage free at 55. That gave them an extra 10 years of saving without a mortgage, so they could save quite a lot. And that meant that the money was going to stretch until they were 80. In their situation, we've got a gap between age 80 to 90, right? So that's the gap that your wealth strategy has got to close, should close. So just to illustrate the power of leverage, so this is for those who do have equity. If you had $160,000 and put it into shares or a managed fund, and let's say you got a 6% return after tax, after fees, so that's quite generous, but let's just say that you do. And let's say we put $160,000 into a property. Well, we don't buy a $160,000 property, do we? We use that as a 20% deposit. That allows us to buy an $800,000 property. We get the capital growth on that property at 6%, which is $48,000 a year. But we've got to top up that property. So let's say that costs us $200 a week or $10,000 a year. Deduct that off the growth. So you've made $38,000. Compare that to the managed funds. You can see that it's 3 to 4 times more. Same amount of money for the same time frame. Admittedly less liquid, but you're positioning yourself so that you can hold to unlock that gain. So it's not that property is amazing, it's just that leverage is amazing. And so if we were to compare it against the best performing share on the stock exchange, property outperforms over a 10-year period by 250%. It also has less volatility than other assets. Now, once you've closed your retirement gap, your need for property will shift. That's when we look to diversify you into non-property assets. And eventually, we want your wealth to be 50-50 between property and non-property assets. And when I'm talking about wealth in that situation, I'm talking about assets outside of the home that you live in. Eventually, we want that to be 50-50 between property and managed funds or non-property assets. But that's assuming you have solved your wealth gap. You've got to resolve that first. And to solve that, you need to use leverage. So property kind of features at different stages, and managed funds features at different stages, depending on where you're at in that wealth creation journey. So just a few other things. If we look at leverage, so this is just comparing property against the stock exchange, Briscoe shares and term deposits. Property's the red one. So they're all going up, I guess, with the exception of term deposits. Even though term deposits have marginally increased, so that's great. You're going to see that this property outperforms the others. So if your objective is to grow wealth, this is what outperforms. From a volatility perspective, this might be a little bit hard to see, but you can this is the movement and returns of the different asset classes. That property, which is the red line, has less volatility than the other asset classes, which is interesting, right? Because or leveraged property, that is, because you think because it's giving you more growth, more upside, that usually the trade-off to that, certainly in the share market and with managed funds, is the more growth you get, you should expect more volatility, whereas property defies that. House prices against interest rates, you can see that there, because that's the thing, is interest rates start to drop, house prices increase. It's normally delayed slightly by a few months, but very rough pigeon economics is for every 1% drop in interest rates tends to lend itself to a 10% lift in house prices. So we'll be expecting house prices to lift over the next 12 months to reflect that. Now, with any investment comes risk, whether it's property or non-property. Don't buy the wrong property. So if I was working with you, I would first try and minimize the wealth gap by maximizing your cash surplus and getting you mortgage free faster. Then we'd say, well, if let's say the gap is $500,000, I would work out, well, how much do I have to spend on solving that problem? Now, most of our clients don't have cash per se, they've got equity, but we'd be adding together equity and cash to work out, well, what do we do with the combined amount? Let's say we could buy a property to the value of $700,000, hypothetically, and I'm trying to solve a $500,000 gap. I want to work out, well, what is the capital growth rate I need on that property to give me that return? Because I'm not doing this for the love of it. So based on that capital growth rate, that will tell me the regions we should consider investing in and the regions we should avoid. It will tell me the type of property that's suitable, whether it's a townhouse, which has, or an apartment, say, that has less capital gain potential than a standalone property, the number of bedrooms and what it can rent for. All of this becomes your property criteria. I then give that to our property team to go and shortlist some properties for my clients, or I give it to you. I don't care who finds the properties, but we're not doing it for the love of it, right? It's to solve a particular problem. And yeah, so kind of don't just sleepwalk into thinking I just need to buy a property. You need to buy a property that solves your problem with the least possible risk of things going wrong. I think the key to making money with property is being able to hold the property for long enough to get the gain. The downward pressure to you achieving that is the weekly top up that you have to make. The higher the top up, the less likely you'll be able to do it indefinitely. So once we've got you mortgage free on your home, we then focus on reducing the mortgage on the investment property so that the rent can cover all outgoings, so the property doesn't cost you. Right, so you've got to have a defensive play. Your whole strategy is just as important as getting the right property. The more we can make you cash resilient to strengthen your cash savings, your ability to kind of withstand things going wrong, the more likely you'll be able to hold. One of the questions that's actually just come up is, with a managed fund, because managed funds, are you exposed to property within a managed fund? And invariably you are, depending on the type of fund that you're in. So you've got your aggressive funds, your balanced, growth, balanced, conservative, defensive. They each have a property weighting within those, where the fund itself is invested in some properties. The problem with that, though, is you're not benefiting from leverage, because you can't leverage your managed fund. So it's leverage which is the key to unlocking more growth for you. So the question probably is, do you need to get more growth, or do you have plenty of money and you can withstand negative things happening over the next 20 years? And if you can, then we're kind of relaxed as to where you put your money, but you should be diversifying outside of managed funds. And typically we'd want a 50-50 split between property and managed funds. And those properties, if you've got enough wealth for retirement, that could be a commercial property. It could be part of a property syndicate. It could be a unit trust. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you are managing the property yourself. We only kind of move to that managing of your property yourself when you need to use leverage to grow wealth. So we kind of move through different stages as we go through. One of the questions also, and it might be easier if you pop this into the Q&A, one of the questions that's come through is, what if I'm 59? Is this strategy still appropriate? Yes, it is, but it depends on what's the size of your retirement gap. So I need to first optimize your situation before I can determine that property is the right strategy for you. And if it's not, I'll go down the managed fund route, because it doesn't bother me where we invest your funds. We've got access to all of these asset types for our clients. If I was going down the managed fund route, then I'd be saying, okay, well, what is the return that I need to be getting? What is the volatility that I can tolerate? How long before I need to access these funds? There's sort of a different set of questions we need to go down if it's the managed fund route. But if I go up a level, if the gap between now, but if your retirement gap is more than $300,000, irrespective of how long we've got to retirement, we need a wealth creation strategy. And we'll work out, well, what are the options for you? If it can be investment property, perhaps we go down that route. If it can't, what are our alternate solutions? Because our job is to make sure you arrive closer to your goal than what you're on track to do if you did nothing. Always comes back to, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What are the requirements of this particular investment? What are the timeframes we need this investment to perform for us? What's our risk preferences? What are our requirements, right? We just don't sleepwalk. We're very deliberate with the strategies that we apply, right down to your behaviors. Some strategies are more appropriate for shoppers, some are more appropriate for savers. Your mortgage repayment plan is different depending on the size of your cash surplus and the ratio between your income and debt. And your wealth strategy depends on what is the gap we're trying to solve for retirement and how long we have to solve it for. Now, I would love to help all of you. My team would love to help all of you. I'm going to take some questions in a second, but if you do want to come to a session with one of our amazing advisors, the cost is normally $400, but it's discounted to $149. You just need to book that session in the next day or so, but you've got, I don't know, 6 weeks to have the session. So there's no rush to have the session, just a little bit of a rush to redeem the discount. Or if you don't redeem it in time, you still get a discount, but the cost is $249. Now, the purpose of that first meeting is to work out, well, where are you now? Back to kind of the starting point. What are you trying to achieve? Where are all the inefficiencies? And if we were to work with you to kind of squeeze out those inefficiencies, does that change the problem we're trying to solve? Usually it does. Usually it makes it smaller. And based on that problem, what are the strategies we're going to need to apply? And depending on your age, what is the urgency of us doing something? If retirement's 20, 30, 40 years away, the urgency of you having to do something might be quite small, unless your objective is to retire early. And then we want to get a trot on, right? And it's more of an ambitious goal rather than a defensive goal of, oh my gosh, my income runway is running out. It just depends on you, the cards you've been dealt, as to what's going to be the best strategy for you. Someone's asking, how do I scan that code? I've got no clue. But we're going to bring someone in now who's got some questions to ask that have come through from some of the audience. They might be able to answer this question as well.
Hi, Hannah. I can help with the QR code question. If you hold your camera up to that QR code, a little link will show and you can just tap on that link and it will take you to the landing page. We will get on with some of the questions because we do have a few that have come through, Hannah. The first one is, what do we need to be aware of when purchasing an existing property that is not a new build?
Okay, so if you're not buying a new build, the challenges you've got, the bank will require a higher deposit. So sometimes they require, the kind of worst case scenario, they require twice the size of the deposit, maybe a little bit less. So a new build only has a 20% deposit. An existing property is 30, and in some banks 40%. That's the first thing. With an existing property, you'd be settling sooner. So you'll be having a top up earlier and probably at a higher interest rate. With new builds, if you can get some form of delay, deferment in the settlement, possibly because it's not yet completed, then in the current economic environment, that should position you for delaying the weekly top up, but also hopefully lower interest rates when you do settle. With new builds, certainly our property team can negotiate rent guarantees, which give you certainty of income, irrespective of whether the property is tenanted or what the tenant is paying. You don't get that with existing properties. You also tend to have higher repairs and maintenance costs with existing properties. So we tend to add another 10% of the cost over the first 10 years to reflect some of those extra costs that you don't tend to get with new. It's not to say that existing can't work, but there are some trade-offs that can be quite expensive. But the deposit one's probably the biggest one, because with that same deposit for an existing property, you could get almost 2 new properties, right? So that's important, especially if you're cross-securing that to your home. You're trying to minimize that exposure.
Thanks, Hannah. So when is the right time to consider buying another property if you are still paying off the mortgage on your first home?
I like to do it at the same time. Not everyone has the appetite for that, but shoppers definitely have the appetite for it. So that would be my preference. I'm all about let's get this show on the road. Let's not muck about. Now, some situations require you to get on with it because your runway to retirement is a lot shorter. So you don't have the luxury of staging it out. And other situations where it's so far away before you hit your goals, you could say, well, I might wait until I'm mortgage free before I start thinking about my other wealth situation. I personally like to stack them on top of each other because you never know what's around your corner, and you want to, I'm always about maximizing forward momentum at any point.
Great, thank you. I am 44 years old. Is it still a good idea at my age to withdraw my KiwiSaver to buy a house?
Could be. So I'm assuming you don't yet own a home, then if that's the case. It might make more sense to not do that and to buy an investment property that doesn't allow you to access your KiwiSaver because it's an investment property as opposed to a home. The question we need to be asking is what's the opportunity cost of buying a home as your first property or buying an investment property? And often with a home, the mortgage is a lot higher because you're sort of emotionally attached to it. And the problem with that, that those mortgage costs and the rates and the insurance and the repairs and maintenance is often $10,000 to $20,000 a year higher than if you were renting a similar property or just a similar property. So from a cash flow perspective, it can make more sense to rent, provided you like the property that you're renting. But we still want you benefiting from the property market. So historically, we've said just buy a home, and that'll be how you do it. Whereas now you can make more money if it's an investment property and keep your living costs lower through renting yourself rather than owning that home.
Great, thank you. If I have extra cash, is it better to use it to invest or to pay down my mortgage?
We'd want you to do both. So what I mean by that is you would pay down your mortgage, but we would want to be able to re-access the equity that you have created through paying down the mortgage and recycle that as a deposit for an investment property.
I am considering buying property for my son to rent to own. What would be the pros and cons of doing this?
Well, I don't tend to mix my drinks on that. It just gets murky when you do that with family. the intention, I'm assuming, is you're trying to get your son or your child, I don't know if it was a son, on the property ladder and facing forward and making progress and know what direction they're going in. And I understand that, and I applaud that. That's what we all want for our kids. Me personally, with many of my clients, I would prefer to buy an investment property that is earmarked for them. Not that you necessarily tell them, but the capital growth on that property could be sold in the future, and that becomes their deposit for their home. Or we'd own a property together and we would share in the top up, so they're benefiting from that. And probably the only variation to that is if your child is disadvantaged in some way, then creating a certain outcome for their living arrangement might serve you in a different way. But if there was no disadvantage, I think it's better to buy a property that is a genuine investment property. And if you want them sharing that journey, own it jointly with them. Or if they're too young to benefit or be part of that, have a property that's earmarked, the capital growth on that property is earmarked to help them onto the property ladder in the future.
Great, thank you. We have more than 50% equity in both our home and our rental property. Can we shift our home mortgage to the rental? We currently don't top up our rental at all. It's self-sufficient.
Yeah, there's a way to do that. It's sort of a little bit complicated from a legal structure and a tax side of things, but the short answer is yes, you can do that. If you have the right paperwork behind it. If you don't have the right paperwork, then that is considered tax avoidance. So best you don't do it that way.
Is $1 million retirement figure goal for one person, and would this mean that it's $2 million for a couple?
It's normally about 1.5 times for a couple, so like 1.5 million. The average gap of my clients is probably 1.5 million as a starter, but many of these are wanting to live a lifestyle to which they are accustomed, right? So that costs a little bit more. Or if you're like me, I want to live a lifestyle and I want to retire well before 65. So it means I need more wealth to reflect that.
Great, thank you. And we have time for just one more question. How can I find the courage to stop using term deposits as my main investment?
Well, it comes down to understanding your situation. Term deposits might give you the return that you need, which would assume you don't need any return, to solve your problem. But I think sometimes being confronted with your situation and what the future looks like and what the options that are available to you are, including a term deposit, and then having those options compared, can give you the clarity to make bolder decisions. I think in the absence of knowing those things, you just revert back to, okay, well, surely this is the safest thing to do, even though it actually creates possibly the more risk for you in the future. But all that can be quite opaque and quite intimidating unless someone's taking you through that. So I think you will find your confidence when you understand the impact of those decisions and it's explained to you what your options are and what your strategy needs to be. But look, I hope you enjoyed that. It was very nice to speak with you guys, and yeah, I hope to see you guys for a session. Take care.